When you think about the Vietnam War, what comes to mind? Well, the truth is, it wasn't just one war. It was a brutal conflict fought on at least 4 different fronts, all at the same time. Yeah, there was the war in the jungles of Southeast Asia for sure, but there was also a war being fought in American living rooms, a war on the evening news, and a war for the very soul of a generation. We're going to break down how this multi-front conflict basically tore a nation apart.
Okay, let's just stop and think about this quote for a second. VC, of course, stood for the Viet Cong, the enemy. But this single, chilling sentence from a Marine on the ground, it just perfectly captures the core problem of the entire war. In a brutal, confusing insurgency where American soldiers couldn't tell a friendly civilian from an enemy fighter, this grim rule of thumb became a way to survive. It's a really stark look at the moral quicksand these soldiers were wading through every single day.
And that, right there, was the unsolvable puzzle for the entire U.S. military. I mean, seriously, how do you defeat an enemy you can't even find? An enemy who's a rice farmer by day and a guerrilla fighter by night. This fundamental confusion is exactly what led to the multi-front strategy we're about to unpack.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll look at the war of perceptions, the fierce battle for public opinion, the so-called lottery of life that was the draft, and the secret dirty war that was fought in the shadows.
First things first, we've got to get our heads around the military strategy itself. See, this wasn't a war like World War II, with clear objectives like capturing cities or planting flags on hills. For the American command, led by General William Westmoreland, this was what they called a war of attrition.
So what does that actually mean? Well, the whole strategy boiled down to a simple and pretty grim metric, the body count. The thinking was, if the U.S. could just kill Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers faster than they could be replaced, eventually the enemy's will to fight would just collapse. Victory wasn't a place on a map, it was a number on a spreadsheet.
And this focus on body counts created this huge disconnect. Publicly, President Johnson's administration was promising progress, always talking about seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But privately, a secret Defense Department report admitted the cold, hard truth. It was a bloody stalemate, even with 500,000 troops on the ground. This giant gulf between the official story and the reality, well, it got a name. The credibility gap. And that credibility gap didn't just leak out bit by bit. No, it basically exploded into the public consciousness in January of 1968 with something called the Tet Offensive.
Now, on paper, from a purely military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the communists. They lost tens of thousands of fighters. But you know what? That didn't matter one bit. What mattered was what Americans saw on their TV screens every night. An enemy that they'd been told was on the brink of collapse was now attacking the U.S. Embassy itself. The official narrative was shattered, live, right in their living rooms.
This satirical column from Art Bushwell just perfectly captured the public's brand new cynicism. By comparing the government's optimism to General Custer's, right before he and all his men were wiped out, Bushwell delivered this brutal takedown of the credibility gap. And the joke landed because for millions of Americans, it felt painfully true.
And the fallout from this shattered trust? You can see it right here in the numbers. Among young people, the very generation being drafted to fight, support for the war just plummeted. It went from over 70% down to just 45% right after the Tet Offensive. The battle for public opinion was being lost badly right here at home.
So, while the war was raging in Vietnam and on TV screens, a third front was opening up. This one was built on pure chance, a ton of anxiety, and this growing feeling of profound unfairness. I'm talking about the draft lottery.
Imagine this. On December 1st, 1969, the futures of nearly 1 million young men, all born between 1944 and 1950, were literally placed into 366 little blue plastic capsules. Their entire lives, college, jobs, marriage, maybe even survival itself, were all going to be decided by the order those capsules were pulled from a glass jar on national television.
See, the old draft system had been a mess, widely criticized for favoring the wealthy and well-connected, who could always find a way to get a deferment. So the lottery was supposed to be the great equalizer, a fix to make it completely random. A birthday gets drawn, it gets number 1. The next gets number 2. Simple. If your number was low, you were going to Vietnam. If it was high, you were safe. It was supposed to be undeniably fair.
But it wasn't random, not even close. As people started analyzing the results, a truly shocking pattern emerged. Men born in the first half of the year had an average draft number of 201, pretty safe. But men born in the second half of the year, Their average was a dangerously low 121. The fair lottery was clearly, provably biased.
So what on earth went wrong? Well, it was a shockingly simple and fatal flaw in the process. They put the capsules in the box month by month, January 1st, then February on top, and so on. But they didn't mix them properly. This created a layer cake effect, leaving the December capsules right near the top, all but guaranteeing they'd be drawn first and get the lowest, most dangerous numbers.
And this wasn't just some conspiracy theory. The math proved it. A simulation confirmed that the probability of getting a result this skewed by pure chance was just 1.2%. It was practically impossible. So the very system designed to restore faith and fairness was itself demonstrably unfair. And this wasn't just a bureaucratic blunder. It poured gasoline on the fire of the anti-war movement.
All right, at the very same time all this was happening, a fourth front was being waged far away from the cameras, deep in the villages and hamlets of South Vietnam. This was a secret, brutal, and highly controversial war against the insurgency's support network.
It was called the Phoenix Program, and its goal was to dismantle the Viet Cong from the inside out. But it didn't target the soldiers. No, it went after the civilian infrastructure that kept the insurgency alive, the tax collectors, the political organizers, the recruiters. The CIA's idea was to use a rifle-shot approach to precisely target these leaders instead of the shotgun blast of conventional warfare.
The program's scale was just massive. Neutralize was the official, clinical-sounding word for it, and it meant one of three things: capture, convince them to defect, or kill them. Between 1968 and 1972, the program neutralized over 81,000 suspected Viet Cong members. And this chart really breaks down what neutralized actually meant. Nearly a third of them, over 26,000 people, were killed. And it's so important to understand, many of these weren't soldiers killed in a firefight. They were civilian leaders targeted for elimination. Now, to get the information on who to target, the Phoenix program relied on interrogation methods that, frankly, amounted to systematic torture. This wasn't the random abuse of a few rogue soldiers. It was a set of horrifying, sanctioned techniques with their own chilling nicknames, used as a matter of policy. To really get a handle on the moral crisis of this war, you have to look at these two faces of brutality side by side. The My Lai massacre, when the public found out about it, was an atrocity born of chaos and frustration. It came from the bottom up. But the Phoenix program was different. It was a cold, calculated, top-down system of assassination and torture. Both of them horrified the American public when they came to light, deepening that credibility gap and just revealing the depths of the war's moral decay. So you see how this is all building, right? All of these fronts, the credibility gap, the living room war, the flawed draft, the secret atrocities, they all eventually came crashing together to destroy the one thing a democracy absolutely needs to wage a long, costly war: its political will. This timeline shows a nation literally coming apart at the seams. Just think about this short period of just over 2 years. First, the public is shocked by Tet. Then the country loses its greatest moral leader, Martin Luther King Jr., and a leading anti-war presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy, to assassins' bullets. Then comes the horrifying truth of My Lai, followed by the infuriating mess of the draft lottery. And for many, the breaking point: American soldiers firing on and killing American students protesting the war at Kent State University. The war wasn't being lost in Vietnam anymore, it was being lost at home. And this collapse was happening on two parallel tracks. In Vietnam, military morale hit rock bottom. We're talking widespread refusal to go on missions, and even soldiers attacking their own officers in acts of fragging. At the same time, back home, the anti-war movement just exploded. Draft cards were being burned in public, and the country fractured along these deep, bitter, political and generational lines. The front lines weren't just in the jungle, they were at the family dinner table. And this, right here, is the key takeaway. This is why it all matters. Vietnam demonstrated a profound truth about modern warfare. A democracy cannot sustain a long, morally ambiguous war without the broad support of its people. America didn't run out of bombs or bullets, it ran out of consensus. It ran out of unity. It ran out of the moral authority to ask its citizens to keep fighting and dying for a cause they no longer believed in. The war left this deep and lasting scar on the American psyche, what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome. It was this profound national reluctance to commit U.S. forces to foreign conflicts, born from the fear of getting stuck in another costly, divisive quagmire. And that fear, the fear of another Vietnam, it shaped American foreign policy for decades to come.
And that leaves us with one last big question. The Vietnam War was really America's first taste of modern, unconventional warfare. A conflict with no clear front lines, fought against an insurgency, where public perception and political will were every bit as important as military might. So looking at the world today, with all of its complex conflicts, you have to ask, have we truly absorbed the painful lessons from that multi-front war? Or are we maybe destined to learn some of them all over again?